September 20, 1942. Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, California. The early Pacific breeze moved quietly across the airfield, but tension hung thick inside one guarded hangar. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders sat in the cockpit of an aircraft no American pilot was ever meant to touch. As he wrapped his hands around the control column, moisture gathered on his palms not from heat, but from the weight of history pressing down on him. Every dial, label, and gauge in front of him was written in Japanese. The layout defied Western design logic. The metal surfaces carried unfamiliar textures, and the interior air was heavy with foreign lubricants and fuel. This was not a prototype nor a captured wreck. It was a fully intact Mitsubishi A6M Zero, serial number 2110, the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Outside the aircraft, armed Marines stood watch. Their presence had been mandatory since the plane arrived 3 weeks earlier under strict secrecy. This machine represented an intelligence prize beyond measure. And now Sanders was about to make history as the first American pilot to fly Japan's most advanced fighter. He eased the throttle forward and released the brakes. The Zero rolled smoothly across the tarmac, its engine running with an elegance that surprised even seasoned test pilots. Within moments of takeoff, Sanders would begin uncovering critical flaws limitations that would soon reshape U.S. air combat doctrine. Knowledge gained from this aircraft would directly contribute to fighter designs and tactics that ultimately destroyed thousands of enemy planes, stripping Japan of its early aerial dominance. Yet this turning point did not begin in California. 5 months earlier, June 4, 1942, rain and fog blanketed the Aleutian Islands, a remote and often overlooked corner of the Pacific Theater. On that same day, hundreds of miles to the south, American dive bombers were setting Japanese aircraft carriers ablaze at Midway, a battle that would permanently alter the balance of naval power. While history focused on Midway, another chain of events was quietly unfolding in Alaska. As part of a diversionary operation meant to draw U.S. attention northward, Japanese forces launched airstrikes against the American base at Dutch Harbor. Among the pilots was 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga, flying a Zero from the aircraft carrier Rijo. Koga took off alongside his formation leaders, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Togo Shikada. The mission initially went exactly as planned. The attackers overwhelmed defenses, shot down a U.S. PBY Catalina patrol aircraft, and strafed American personnel in the water below. In these moments, the Zero demonstrated everything it was built for: speed, agility, and dominance over Allied aircraft. Then, a single round changed the outcome. Ground fire from Dutch Harbor, believed to be from a .50 caliber machine gun, punched through Koga's aircraft, rupturing the oil return line. For an engine that relied on precise lubrication, the damage was catastrophic. Oil sprayed freely, and Koga understood the grim math perhaps 15 minutes before total engine failure. He radioed his commander and turned east toward Akutan Island, approximately 25 miles away. Japanese planners had designated it as an emergency landing zone, with a submarine stationed offshore to recover downed pilots. As Akutan came into view, Koga spotted what appeared to be an ideal landing area, a wide, grassy stretch set slightly inland from the coast. From the air, it looked firm and level. His wingmen circled above as Koga lowered his landing gear and committed to a standard wheels-down approach. On a second pass, Shikada noticed something unsettling: water reflecting faintly between blades of grass. The field was no field at all. It was a bog, its surface masking deep mud and standing water. He attempted to warn Koga over the radio, but the timing was unforgiving. The Zero touched down at roughly 80 miles per hour. For an instant, it seemed the landing had worked. Then the wheels dug violently into the saturated ground. The aircraft's forward motion continued while the landing gear abruptly stopped. Momentum flipped the lightweight fighter forward in a brutal rotation. The Zero overturned completely, slamming upside down into the mud. The impact was fatal. The force of the crash snapped Koga's neck, killing him instantly. The aircraft, however, remained largely intact, resting quietly in the Alaskan bog, unnoticed for weeks. That wreck, preserved by cold and isolation, would eventually be recovered, repaired, and transported to the United States. And from that silent crash site, one of the most decisive intelligence breakthroughs of the Pacific War was born. The aircraft came to rest upside down, its fuselage lodged in the marsh like a fallen relic frozen in time. Inside the inverted cockpit, the pilot's body hung motionless, restrained by his seat harness. His uniform showed no signs of violence or fire damage, remaining almost immaculate. A service pistol and ceremonial sword were still secured at his side, while carefully applied medical bandages wrapped around his torso, silent evidence of injuries sustained long before this final flight. High above the crash site, his fellow pilots circled in torment. Regulations were unambiguous. Any disabled Zero fighter was to be destroyed immediately to prevent capture by enemy forces. Again and again, they passed over the wreck, weapons armed, scanning desperately for movement or signs of life. Yet the aircraft appeared eerily whole, resting inverted in the wetland like a stranded animal. The possibility that their comrade might still be alive, trapped, injured, but breathing made the order unbearable. To fire would be to knowingly end his life. Unable to accept that risk, they held their fire. With fuel gauges dropping and daylight slipping away, the pilots eventually turned back toward their carrier, the Ryujo, carrying with them the weight of an unresolved fate. A Japanese submarine dispatched to retrieve downed aviators searched the waters surrounding Akutan Island for several hours. Its mission ended abruptly when it was forced to withdraw under threat from the American destroyer USS Williamson. From that moment on, both pilot and aircraft were abandoned, isolated in the Aleutian wilderness, nearly 5,000 miles from home. Unknown to Japan, this solitary wreck would soon expose the inner workings of the Empire's most formidable aerial weapon. For more than a month, the Zero fighter remained untouched, sinking slowly into obscurity. The crash site lay far from commercial sea routes and routine aerial patrol paths, concealed within a shallow valley. The Aleutian's persistent fog allowed only a handful of clear days each month, keeping the aircraft hidden beneath layers of mist and silence. Any Japanese naval forces capable of mounting a search had already withdrawn westward following the devastating losses at the Battle of Midway. The young pilot was officially listed as missing, then dead. Another name added to a growing tally as the momentum of the Pacific War shifted decisively against Japan. Everything changed on July 10, 1942. That day, an American PBY Catalina patrol aircraft, flown by Lieutenant William Thies, lost its bearings while navigating the treacherous skies of the Aleutians. In this region, traditional navigation was unreliable. Magnetic compasses behaved erratically near the Arctic Circle, and the landscape below was almost perpetually obscured by cloud and fog. These had been relying on dead reckoning when a brief opening in the overcast revealed the Shumagan Islands. Recognizing the landmarks, he recalculated his position and adjusted course toward Dutch Harbor. To conserve time and fuel, he chose a direct route over Akutan Island rather than skirting its coastline. At that moment, chance intervened. Albert Knack, a machinist's mate serving as the aircraft's plane captain, happened to look down through a temporary thinning in the fog. What he saw immediately caught his attention, an unnatural shape embedded in the marsh below. As the aircraft circled, the markings became unmistakable, bright red insignia painted on the wings of a Japanese fighter. These made multiple passes over the site, carefully plotting its location on his navigation charts. The aircraft appeared astonishingly well preserved. Understanding the significance of the discovery, he returned at once to Dutch Harbor to report it. Within hours, an American recovery team was dispatched to the island. Their findings surpassed all expectations. The Zero had come down in what was likely the only area on Akutan Island capable of saving it. The bog beneath the aircraft was soft enough to absorb the impact, yet solid enough to prevent the fighter from sinking or breaking apart. Acting like a massive natural shock absorber, the marsh dissipated forces that would have otherwise destroyed the airframe. Damage was present but limited. The canopy had shattered, the propeller blades were bent, the landing gear had failed, and the wing tips showed signs of impact. Despite this, the aircraft's structure, controls, and systems remained largely intact. The recovery team carefully removed the pilot's remains from the cockpit and buried him with full military honors on a nearby hillside overlooking the crash site. They documented the medical taping around his torso, suggesting prior wounds or protective measures against extreme flight stresses. His personal belongings, including his sidearm and sword, were collected for intelligence analysis. What followed was a logistical ordeal. Recovering a fighter aircraft from an Aleutian bog proved to be a grueling operation that stretched over nearly 3 weeks. Crews labored in relentless cold and moisture, where tools seized overnight and metal surfaces rusted almost immediately. Using logs and planks, they constructed a temporary roadway across half a mile of unstable terrain. Inch by inch, the Zero was hauled across the marsh by winches until it reached firmer ground at Broad Bight, where it could finally be loaded onto a barge. The conditions were brutal, but the reward was unparalleled. For the first time, the United States had captured an intact example of Japan's premier fighter aircraft, an intelligence windfall that would profoundly influence the air war in the Pacific. By the end of July 1942, the captured Mitsubishi A6M Zero had been carefully prepared for a long and secretive journey across the Pacific. Secured aboard a cargo vessel, the aircraft, already recognized as the most significant enemy fighter ever recovered intact, was quietly sent eastward. In early August, the ship departed through southern waters that had only recently echoed with the clashes of Japanese and American naval forces, a stark reminder of how rapidly the tide of war was shifting. The Zero reached Seattle on August 1, 1942. Almost immediately, it was transferred onto a barge for transport down the west coast to Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego. By mid-August, the aircraft arrived at its destination, where it was unloaded under strict security and moved into a tightly guarded hangar. Military police maintained round-the-clock surveillance, ensuring that no unauthorized personnel or souvenir seekers could get close to the priceless machine. News of the captured fighter spread rapidly among U.S. Navy aviation circles, generating intense excitement and anticipation. For the first time since the Zero had stunned the world during its dramatic appearance over Pearl Harbor, American engineers and pilots would finally be able to study the aircraft firsthand. Navy Captain William Leonard, who would later command a carrier division in the Pacific, described the fighter as a priceless asset, one that revealed critical answers at a moment when such knowledge was desperately needed. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh, who would survive the war as a top ace with 21 confirmed victories, later credited the intelligence gained from examining this very aircraft with saving his life multiple times. Understanding how to respond when a Zero appeared on his tail, he said, made all the difference. The urgency was unmistakable. Every day the aircraft remained grounded meant another day American pilots faced an enemy they only partially understood. The race began to return the Zero to flying condition as quickly as possible. A dedicated restoration team worked relentlessly, documenting every aspect of the aircraft while simultaneously repairing the damage caused during its forced landing. The pace of progress was remarkable, driven by the realization that this single fighter might hold the key to turning the air war in the Pacific. As the restoration advanced, the engineers uncovered immediate insights into Japanese aircraft design. One technician famously remarked that the Zero was assembled like a finely tuned watch. Flush rivets covered the airframe, and the weapons were mounted seamlessly within the wings to reduce aerodynamic drag. Weight reduction governed every design choice. The instrument panel was strikingly uncluttered, displaying only essential gauges arranged for rapid comprehension. Access panels could be opened by pressing clearly marked points with a finger, releasing hidden latches beneath the skin. The aircraft's modular construction allowed it to be dismantled and reassembled with minimal tools, an enormous advantage for maintenance on remote island airstrips with limited resources. Detailed measurements revealed that the Zero weighed between approximately 5,300 and 6,165 pounds when fully loaded, depending on fuel, ammunition, and configuration. This made it nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than its American counterpart, the F6F Wildcat. Such dramatic weight savings were achieved through deliberate sacrifices. The aircraft provided no armor protection for the pilot, instead relying on extreme maneuverability to avoid enemy fire. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing, increasing capacity while greatly reducing survivability. The airframe itself used only the bare minimum of structural material strong enough for expected loads, but with virtually no safety margin. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to American fighter design. U.S. aircraft emphasized pilot protection and structural durability, accepting additional weight in exchange for survivability. The Zero, by comparison, was built to win by outmaneuvering its opponents rather than enduring damage. It was a fighter optimized for agility above all else. Further examination revealed additional technical revelations. The engine, a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial producing roughly 950 horsepower, used a float-type carburetor, a feature that would later prove critical in combat encounters. The wings folded manually for carrier storage using a simple mechanical system, eliminating the need for hydraulics. Control surfaces were fabric covered over metal frames to further reduce weight. Despite its light construction, the Zero carried an impressive weapons load. Two 7.7mm machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, along with two 20mm cannons mounted in the wings. By September 20, only 41 days after its arrival in San Diego, the Zero was once again airworthy. The restoration team had replaced the shattered windscreen, corrected damage to the vertical stabilizer and rudder, repaired the wingtips and flaps, and completely rebuilt the landing gear that had been torn away during the crash. The original three-bladed Sumitomo propeller was meticulously restored and returned to service. The aircraft was repainted, its red Japanese Hinamaru insignia concealed beneath American blue roundels and white stars. Visually, it appeared to be an American fighter, yet its lines and proportions unmistakably revealed its origins. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, chosen as the project's chief test pilot, spent the final days before the first flight studying every system, control response, and structural detail. By the time the Zero took to the air again, it was no longer a mystery, it had become a teacher. For long stretches of time, the pilot remained seated inside the narrow cockpit, studying every unfamiliar gauge, switch, and label written in Japanese. He committed the instrument layout to memory, rehearsed procedures in his mind, and prepared himself for a mission unlike any he had flown before. Although Sanders was already a seasoned test pilot, this assignment placed him in an unprecedented situation. He would be flying a captured enemy fighter, one whose true behavior in the air was known only through scattered intelligence summaries and the fragmented accounts of combat pilots. Those reports painted a troubling picture. According to Allied intelligence, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero outperformed American fighters in nearly every category that mattered in a dogfight. It was believed to be faster, able to climb more rapidly, and capable of turning inside anything the US Navy could deploy, yet uncertainty lingered. If the intelligence assessments were inaccurate, or if the captured aircraft concealed structural fatigue or unseen damage, Sanders' very first flight could prove fatal. On the morning of September 20, 1942, preparation gave way to execution. Sanders climbed into the Zero's cockpit, no longer as an observer or student, but as the man who would take it into the sky. The ground crew brought the engine to life, and to everyone's surprise, it started instantly and ran with a smoothness that spoke volumes about the quality of the restoration effort. Months of careful reconstruction had paid off. As Sanders guided the aircraft toward the runway, he was acutely aware of the attention focused on him. Engineers, intelligence analysts, and senior Navy officers stood watching from the control tower and along the flight line, fully aware that the results of this flight could reshape aerial combat doctrine. When Sanders advanced the throttle, the response was immediate. The aircraft surged forward eagerly, gaining speed with remarkable efficiency. After an unusually short takeoff run, the Zero lifted cleanly into the air and began climbing at a rate that would have impressed pilots of any American fighter. Over the next hour, Sanders methodically explored the aircraft's behavior. He climbed to altitude, tested stall responses, executed basic maneuvers, and gradually expanded the limits of the flight envelope. Every control input was deliberate, every response carefully noted. What became clear during this initial sortie would fundamentally alter Allied understanding of the Zero. One limitation revealed itself almost immediately. At airspeeds exceeding 200 knots, the ailerons stiffened dramatically, Rolling the aircraft became sluggish and physically demanding, requiring significant force on the control stick. In his report, Sanders noted a pronounced imbalance. Rolling to the left was noticeably easier than rolling to the right. This high-speed roll deficiency was not subtle. It was severe and entirely unexpected. At lower speeds, however, the Zero lived up to its fearsome reputation. Its agility was extraordinary. In tight, slow-speed maneuvers, it could outturn any American fighter with ease. Yet once speeds passed roughly 200 knots, about 230 miles per hour, the aircraft's responsiveness deteriorated sharply. The fabric-covered control surfaces deformed under increased air pressure, effectively ballooning and resisting pilot input. By contrast, American fighters employed metal control surfaces and, in some cases, hydraulic assistance, allowing them to retain precise control even at high velocity. A second vulnerability emerged during aggressive pushovers and other maneuvers that imposed negative gravitational forces. When Sanders abruptly pushed the nose down, the engine sputtered and quit entirely. The Zero's float-type carburetor, optimized for positive and neutral G-loads, could not sustain fuel delivery under prolonged negative acceleration. Although the engine would relight once positive G-forces returned, the aircraft was left powerless for several critical seconds. The tactical implications were immediately obvious. This flaw offered American pilots a reliable escape technique when pursued by a Zero. Sanders emphasized in his findings that pilots should initiate a steep vertical dive using negative acceleration whenever possible. Doing so would temporarily disable the Zero's engine, allowing the American aircraft to open distance. As speed approached 200 knots, a sharp right roll could further exploit the Zero's aileron weakness before the enemy pilot could bring weapons to bear. In the weeks that followed, Sanders conducted an exhaustive test program. Over a span of 25 days, he completed 24 flights, each designed to extract more data about the aircraft's performance. He flew the Zero at multiple altitudes, experimented with different power settings, and evaluated its behavior under simulated combat loads. Mock dogfights were staged against American fighters, including 4F Wildcats, flown by other experienced test pilots. The volume and quality of data gathered were unprecedented. Contrary to earlier battlefield reports, the Zero's top speed proved to be slightly lower than that of the 4F Wildcat. Sanders suggested that this discrepancy might be explained by added weight from reconstruction, as exact replacement materials had not always been available during restoration. Despite this, one advantage remained undeniable: range. The Zero could fly more than 1,900 statute miles and stay airborne for over 6 hours, far beyond the endurance of any American carrier-based fighter. This capability allowed it to escort bombers deep into hostile territory and patrol enormous stretches of open ocean. The aircraft's climb performance was equally striking. It could reach 20,000 feet faster than an F4F could climb to 15,000 feet. In low-speed turning engagements, the Zero's superiority was unmistakable. It could complete a full turning circle while American fighters managed only 3/4 of one. These findings clarified the mystery of early Pacific air combat. During the opening months of the war, Japanese pilots had enjoyed a decisive edge not merely through training or tactics, but through an aircraft optimized for low-speed maneuvering and long-range operations. In turning fights and slow engagements, the Zero was unmatched by anything the United States fielded in late 1941 and early 1942. Only through careful testing and pilots like Sanders willing to fly the enemy's machine did its hidden weaknesses finally come to light. For all of its remarkable advantages, Sanders' flight testing revealed that the Japanese Zero achieved its performance through compromises that left it dangerously vulnerable. The aircraft's extreme lightness, which granted it exceptional agility, came at a severe cost: survivability. Damage that an American fighter might absorb and continue flying from was often catastrophic for the Zero. It carried no pilot armor, lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, and offered little protection against even brief bursts of enemy fire. Detailed metallurgical examinations of recovered Zero components reinforced these conclusions. Analysts found that the Japanese engineers had access to aluminum alloys of impressive purity and strength. However, these materials were used sparingly. Structural elements were thinner than anything American designers would have approved for frontline combat. The aircraft had been engineered with virtually no margin for damage, built to the bare minimum required for flight performance rather than durability under fire. Sanders consolidated months of test data into a comprehensive report that transformed raw observations into practical combat guidance. His conclusions were clear and unambiguous. American pilots were warned to avoid low-speed, horizontal turning engagements where the Zero's superior maneuverability was overwhelming. Instead, they were advised to fight vertically, exploiting speed, gravity, and structural strength. The recommended tactic emphasized diving attacks that took advantage of the higher top-speed stability of American fighters. If pursued by a Zero, pilots were instructed to enter a steep dive, ideally pushing into negative acceleration. This maneuver could disrupt fuel flow in the Zero's engine, causing it to falter. At high speed, the American pilot was to execute a sharp right roll, an action the Zero could not safely match due to its structural limitations and control stiffness at speed. American aircraft, built with heavier armor and greater firepower, were to accept brief exposure to enemy fire in order to deliver decisive, concentrated bursts. Rather than relying on individual skill alone, Sanders stressed the importance of teamwork. Fighters were to operate in pairs or coordinated formations, covering one another and attacking in sequence. This approach neutralized the Zero's turning advantage and replaced traditional dogfighting with disciplined, cooperative tactics. The Navy distributed Sanders' findings throughout the fleet with unprecedented urgency. Pilots preparing for deployment received detailed briefings outlining the Zero's strengths and vulnerabilities. Training programs were immediately updated, with instructors drilling new aviators in high-speed diving attacks and the now famous hard right roll maneuver. For experienced pilots who had survived earlier encounters, the report was a revelation. For months, American naval aviators had faced an enemy aircraft that seemed almost supernatural, able to climb higher, turn tighter, and dictate the terms of every engagement. Respect for the Zero had grown into something closer to fear. Official guidance when surprised by Zeros had often been to disengage and flee, a tacit admission that American fighters were outmatched. Now that perception began to change. Pilots finally understood not only what the Zero could do, but what it could not. The Japanese fighter remained dangerous, but its aura of invincibility was shattered. It had clear weaknesses, and American airmen now possessed the knowledge to exploit them. Morale rose sharply as confidence replaced uncertainty. Yet the captured Akutan Zero's most enduring impact extended beyond tactical doctrine. Its greatest contribution lay in shaping American fighter design, particularly in aircraft already under development when the Zero was recovered. That aircraft was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, a fighter that would turn hard-won intelligence into overwhelming battlefield dominance. The relationship between the Zero and the Hellcat has long been debated by historians. Some have claimed the Hellcat was directly designed in response to the captured Japanese fighter. Others argue that the development timeline makes such influence impossible. Reality falls between these extremes, a convergence of parallel development, timely combat intelligence, and Grumman's ability to adapt rapidly as new information emerged. January 1942. At Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, company founder Leroy Grumman reviewed early design figures for a new naval fighter. What he saw troubled him. The U.S. Navy urgently needed a replacement for the 4F Wildcat, an aircraft capable of meeting the growing threat in the Pacific. Grumman's engineering team, led by Jake Swerble and Bill Schwendler, had produced a design that was essentially an enlarged, more powerful Wildcat. On paper, it was solid, but Grumman was not convinced it would be enough. Reports arriving from the Pacific were increasingly grim. American pilots were being outperformed repeatedly by Japanese fighters. Though rugged and reliable, the 4F Wildcat was falling behind. Combat data showed that the Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther on less power. The need for a dramatically superior aircraft was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. The initial version of the new fighter, designated XF6F1, was designed around the Wright R2600 Cyclone engine, delivering approximately 1,700 horsepower. This was a significant increase over the Wildcat's Pratt & Whitney R1830, which produced about 1,200 horsepower. Even so, Grumman questioned whether the improvement was sufficient. Development of the XF6F had begun in mid-1941, with a formal Navy contract signed on June 30 of that year, well before the crash of Koga's Zero in Alaska. Throughout early 1942, work progressed rapidly under intense pressure from the Navy, which understood that air superiority would decide the Pacific War. The Bureau of Aeronautics maintained close coordination with Grumman, feeding combat feedback directly into the design process. On April 22, 1942, 6 weeks before the Battle of Midway and 7 weeks before the Zero crash, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare visited Grumman's Bethpage plant. Fresh from defending the carrier Lexington almost single-handedly against Japanese bombers, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor, O'Hare spoke candidly with Grumman engineers about the Wildcat's shortcomings. His assessment was blunt. The Zero was faster than expected, climbed at a rate that seemed to defy its engine output, and could outmaneuver American fighters with ease. O'Hare emphasized that future Navy fighters needed substantially more power, a stronger climb rate, and better pilot visibility. Only a day earlier, O'Hare had stood with President Franklin D. Roosevelt during his Medal of Honor ceremony. When the president asked what kind of aircraft the Navy needed, O'Hare's reply was simple and unforgettable: a plane that will go upstairs faster. Lieutenant Commander A.M. Jackson of the Bureau of Aeronautics worked closely with Grumman to translate these combat lessons into concrete design changes. He insisted the cockpit be raised higher in the fuselage with a gently sloping nose ahead of the pilot to improve forward visibility. His logic was straightforward: a pilot cannot shoot what he cannot see. These visibility improvements were incorporated into the XF6F design before Koga's Zero was even recovered. Then, on April 26, 1942, 5 weeks before the crash, the Bureau of Aeronautics made a defining decision. Based on frontline combat reports and O'Hare's recommendations, Grumman was instructed to abandon the R2600 engine in favor of a far more powerful alternative. The new choice was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing roughly 2,000 horsepower. Already selected for the Vought 4U Corsair and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the R2800 offered a dramatic leap in performance, nearly 50% more power than the original XF6F1 configuration. To accommodate the engine, Grumman was forced to redesign much of the aircraft. The airframe had to be strengthened, engine mounts reinforced, cooling systems revised, and structural elements reworked throughout. These changes delayed development, but the payoff was undeniable. Grumman estimated the upgraded design would deliver performance gains of at least 25% over the original concept. The decision to re-engine the Hellcat was not driven by any single factor. It was the result of multiple forces converging at the same moment: combat experience, pilot testimony, intelligence assessments, and a growing realization that the next naval fighter would need overwhelming power, not marginal improvement. The RI 280 engine had already demonstrated dependable performance during trials and was on track to be utilized in other aircraft projects. Unlike the problematic development of the original R260 engine, Pratt & Whitney could supply the R280 without significant delays. More crucially, combat evaluations made clear that incremental upgrades to existing fighters would be inadequate. The U.S. Navy required a dramatic improvement in performance to rival or surpass the Japanese Zero. The very first XF6F1 prototype, still powered by the R260 Cyclone engine, took to the skies on June 26, 1942, with test pilot Bob Hall at the controls. This flight occurred just over a week before Lieutenant Koga's plane crashed in the Aleutians and roughly 6 weeks prior to the capture of a Zero. The prototype exhibited stable handling and no serious aerodynamic faults, yet the output of the 1,700 horsepower Cyclone confirmed Grumman engineers' concerns. More engine power was necessary. The second prototype, designated F6F was fitted with the 2,000 horsepower R2800 double wasp engine and first flew on July 30, 1942. This flight came 20 days after the discovery of the Akutan Zero, but still 2 months before the captured aircraft would be restored and flown for tests. With the R2800 installed, the F6F's performance far exceeded expectations. The additional horsepower transformed the fighter, delivering the climb rate, top speed, and overall agility needed to contend with the Zero on an even footing. Development of the Hellcat, however, continued intensively throughout the summer of 1942. Grumman engineers constantly refined the aircraft based on frontline combat reports and intelligence from the Pacific Theater. When the Akutan Zero was transported to San Diego in mid-August, detailed technical information began flowing quickly to both the Bureau of Aeronautics and Grumman. Even though the aircraft had not yet flown, careful inspection revealed critical insights regarding its structure, weight, armament, and overall design philosophy. This intelligence arrived at a pivotal point. The F6F's fundamental design was already established, the engine decision finalized, and prototypes flying, but full-scale production had not yet started. As a result, design changes could still be integrated without excessive difficulty. Grumman engineers scrutinized the Zero's design meticulously, seeking ways to ensure their fighter could outperform it. Whereas the Zero weighed between 5,300 and 6,100 pounds fully loaded, the F6F would exceed 12,000 pounds, more than double. Compensating for this weight required both additional power and smart engineering. Unlike the Japanese approach, which emphasized maneuverability at the expense of protection, Grumman's philosophy aimed to combine performance with survivability. After analyzing the captured Zero, company founder Roy Grumman made a decisive choice. The F6F would maintain pilot armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a robust fuselage while still achieving superior performance. The R2800 engine would provide sufficient power to overcome the additional weight. This decision influenced every subsequent aspect of the aircraft's design. The F6F was built to endure combat damage that would destroy a Zero, protecting pilots with armor behind the seat, bullet-resistant windscreens, and self-sealing tanks that minimized fire risk. Redundant systems and a structurally robust airframe ensured the aircraft could survive carrier operations and sustain hits in battle. Information from the Akutan Zero, combined with combat feedback and Sanders test flights in September and October, guided specific design choices as the F6F moved closer to production. Its wings were designed for high-speed efficiency using a distinct airfoil and control configuration compared to the Wildcat. Hydraulically assisted, metal-covered ailerons gave full control at all velocities, directly addressing issues Sanders found in the Zero, which had controls that stiffened at high speeds. The F6F's pressure carburetor eliminated the Zero's vulnerability to engine cutouts under negative acceleration, allowing pilots to dive away without risk of engine failure. Structurally, the F6F could withstand 9G positive and 6G negative forces, far surpassing the Zero's limits. This allowed aggressive maneuvering without structural compromise, while Japanese fighters risked catastrophic failure attempting similar moves. Armament was upgraded to 650 caliber machine guns, with later variants optionally carrying two 20mm cannons plus 450 calibers, providing concentrated firepower to destroy the lightly built Zero quickly. Cockpit visibility was exceptional, with a raised pilot position facilitating situational awareness, addressing the critical need for pilots to see and coordinate with wingmen. The first production F6F flew on October 3, 1942, only 2 weeks after Sanders had flown the restored Akutan Zero. Production had been intentionally delayed so engineers could incorporate the latest intelligence. Contrary to some claims, the Hellcat was not designed because of the Akutan Zero. The basic design and engine selection predated its discovery. Nonetheless, studying the captured Zero allowed Grumman to refine the final configuration and integrate lessons learned before mass production commenced. The first operational F6F seconds entered fleet squadrons in early 1943. Fighting Squadron 9 received their aircraft in February, embarking aboard the carrier Essex for training. pilots immediately recognized the F6F as a transformative aircraft. Compared to months in the F4F Wildcat against superior Japanese aircraft, the Hellcat was a significant upgrade. Faster, more climb-capable, better armed, and easier to handle. Grumman had intentionally engineered the aircraft for newly trained pilots, ensuring no dangerous quirks or difficult behaviors. The fighter was stable, predictable, and forgiving of errors. Carrier landings were manageable due to a rugged landing gear and excellent low-speed control, while the cockpit offered precise visibility for approach judgments. Production escalated with remarkable efficiency. A new Grumman factory at Bethpage, built specifically for fixed manufacturing, began rolling out aircraft even before the facility was fully completed. By 1944, monthly production peaked at 644 aircraft, approximately 1 Hellcat per hour, a record never surpassed. Each F6F required about 20,000 parts supplied by hundreds of subcontractors, while Pratt & Whitney engines were produced at 3 separate plants and shipped for installation. Grumman orchestrated this industrial operation with extraordinary precision, a feat largely credited to production manager Jake Swerble, whose workflow and supply chain management set unprecedented standards for aircraft manufacturing. Despite many of Grumman's workforce having no prior experience in aircraft manufacturing, they succeeded in producing one of the most effective carrier-based fighters of World War II. From the first production flight in October 1942 until the war's conclusion in November 1945, a period of roughly 37 months, Grumman assembled a remarkable 12,275 F6F Hellcats, all from a single manufacturing complex. The Hellcat made its combat debut on August 31, 1943, only 15 months after the discovery of the A6M Zero and 11 months following the initial test flights conducted by Sonder. Early operations quickly demonstrated the aircraft's capabilities. In one of the initial carrier strikes, groups of 5 and 9 Hellcats launched from the USS Yorktown in Independence to attack Marcus Island. The raid was highly successful. No Japanese fighters managed to take off, and several aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Americans lost only 2 Hellcats to anti-aircraft fire. From its first air-to-air engagements, the F6F proved immediately superior to its adversaries. Over the next months, the Hellcat steadily became the primary fighter aboard USS fleet carriers. While the older 4F Wildcat continued to operate from smaller escort carriers, the F6F gradually replaced it on the larger fleet carriers. By early 1944, 15 carrier fighter squadrons were fully equipped with Hellcats, establishing the aircraft as the dominant U.S. naval fighter in the Pacific theater. The tactical insights gained from the captured A6M Zero were integrated into every aspect of the Hellcat's operations. Pilots were trained to avoid slow-turning dogfights unless they held a clear advantage in altitude or numbers. Instead, the operational doctrine emphasized high-speed attacks executed from above. Pilots would dive from altitude to build speed, conduct a single precise firing pass, and then climb back to safety before the more agile Zeros could respond. This approach, along with the Thatch Weave, a defensive tactic devised by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch even prior to the Zero's capture, became standard across fixed squadrons. When attacked, Hellcats would fly in coordinated pairs, weaving in a pattern that forced any pursuing Zero into a head-on confrontation with the partner aircraft. This method effectively negated the Zero's turning advantage and leveraged the Hellcat's superior firepower and rugged construction. Training also emphasized using the aircraft's speed and climbing ability to control engagements. Pilots were instructed to attack when advantageous, but to disengage and reposition when necessary. The Hellcat's climb rate allowed it to regain altitude rapidly after dives, while its top speed enabled it to evade unfavorable encounters. Its extended range and endurance allowed Hellcats to patrol longer and pursue retreating enemies farther than their Japanese counterparts could follow. The F6F faced its first major operational test during the Gilbert Islands campaign on November 23, 1943. Over Tarawa, Hellcats from the USS Essex confronted 30 Japanese Zero fighters attempting to intercept the American strike force. After an intense dogfight spanning the invasion beaches, The Americans claimed the destruction of all 30 enemy aircraft at the cost of a single Hellcat. The engagement confirmed the F6F's design principles. A combination of robust aircraft performance, tactics tailored to enemy weaknesses, and rigorous pilot training produced an overwhelmingly effective combat fighter. The results shocked both American and Japanese command. For the US, it validated the Hellcat's capabilities and tactical doctrine. For Japan, it marked the decline of the Zero's once dominant air superiority. The Battle of Tarawa, however, was only the beginning. Over the following 20 months, the F6F would participate in nearly every major Pacific engagement, consistently establishing the most impressive combat record of any American fighter in the war. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea west of the Mariana Islands, 15 USA aircraft carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers of Task Force 58 faced the largest Japanese carrier strike force since Midway. Japan's 9 carriers launched repeated waves of aircraft in a desperate attempt to halt the American invasion of Saipan, setting the stage for another decisive test of the Hellcat's superiority in carrier warfare. What ensued came to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, an aerial engagement that stands as the most lopsided in naval history. During the initial Japanese assault, 69 aircraft were dispatched, but 42 of these never reached the American fleet. The 27 survivors that made it to the carriers were met with overwhelming anti-aircraft fire and swarms of F6F Hellcats, rendering their attack ineffective. The second wave, consisting of 107 Japanese planes, suffered catastrophic losses as 97 were destroyed before inflicting any damage. Systematic annihilation of Japanese carrier aviation was underway. Across the day, Japanese forces launched a total of 370 aircraft in repeated attacks, yet only 130 returned to their carriers. American F6F Hellcats, conducting continuous combat air patrols and intercepting enemy formations, accounted for the overwhelming majority of Japanese losses. In contrast, American forces lost between 23 and 30 planes, with most pilots rescued from the sea. The strategic consequences for Japan were devastating. The carrier air groups, painstakingly rebuilt after the Battle of Midway, were effectively destroyed. Veteran pilots who had trained a new generation were killed, and aircraft reserves earmarked for decisive engagements had been expended. From that point onward, Japanese naval aviation never regained its former strength. The Battle of the Philippine Sea also highlighted the F6F Hellcat operating at peak efficiency. Its exceptional range enabled continuous fleet coverage through combat air patrols, while its strong climb rate allowed pilots to intercept attackers at advantageous altitudes. The aircraft's speed facilitated pursuit of retreating enemy planes, and its combination of firepower and armor provided overwhelming advantage in direct engagements. Perhaps most crucially, the Hellcat's manageable flight characteristics allowed relatively inexperienced American aviators to operate effectively in combat conditions. By mid-1944, the United States was producing trained pilots at a rate far exceeding Japan's capacity. The F6F allowed these new aviators to enter combat with confidence in their ability to survive and succeed. Conversely, Japanese pilots faced increasingly shortened training programs due to fuel shortages and a dwindling pool of instructors. By the end of 1944, Japanese aviators entered combat with roughly one-third of the flight hours that American pilots had accumulated. The disparity in experience, combined with the F6F's technical superiority, created a relentless cycle of attrition. Each engagement drained Japan of irreplaceable pilots, while American losses were rapidly offset by a robust training pipeline producing thousands of new aviators annually. The Hellcat's influence extended beyond air-to-air combat. Several specialized variants were developed to meet specific operational needs. The F6F-3N and F6F-5N models were equipped with radar pods mounted on the starboard wing, enabling night interception of Japanese bombing raids. While the radar slightly reduced top speed, the tactical advantage during nocturnal operations proved invaluable. Night fighter Hellcats achieved significant success, neutralizing bombers that had previously conducted raids under the cover of darkness. Reconnaissance variants, including the F6F-3P and F6F-5P, replaced armament with cameras conducting critical photographic missions over enemy-held territories. Their combination of speed and range allowed deep penetration into Japanese positions, gathering intelligence and returning safely before interceptors could respond. Later models were adapted to carry 2,000-pound bombs on a centerline rack and rockets beneath the wings, transforming the Hellcat into an effective fighter bomber. These modified F6Fs provided precise close air support to Marine and Army units on Pacific Islands, targeting bunkers, artillery, and troop formations with a level of accuracy artillery could not match. By the end of World War II, the F6F Hellcat had achieved a combat record unmatched by any other American fighter. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots were credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air engagements, with an additional 60 confirmed in other theaters, bringing the combined total including Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm victories to 5,223. Air-to-air losses were limited to 270 Hellcats, yielding an extraordinary kill-to-loss ratio of 19:1. Against Japanese Zero fighters, the ratio stood at 13:1. These figures reflected not only the Hellcat's superior design but also effective tactical doctrines derived from studying the A6M Zero. Combined with increasingly skilled American pilots confronting a diminishing Japanese force. The F6F also produced more aces than any other Allied aircraft during the war. Between 305 and 307 Navy Hellcat pilots achieved ace status, credited with 5 or more aerial victories. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace, scored all 34 of his confirmed kills while flying F6Fs. In sum, the F6F Hellcat's technical excellence, versatility, and ease of operation, combined with the United States' expanding pilot production, played a decisive role in establishing air superiority in the Pacific, hastening the collapse of Japanese naval aviation and contributing directly to Allied victory. By the final years of World War II, the F6F Hellcat had established a level of combat dominance that fundamentally altered Japanese aerial tactics. Pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, once confident in their Mitsubishi Zero, began to show what American intelligence analysts later referred to as zero fatigue, a marked tendency to avoid engaging Hellcats, recognizing that confrontations were likely fatal. Increasingly, Japanese aviators chose to dive away, retreat into cloud cover, or otherwise evade combat rather than face the F6F directly. This psychological edge was as consequential as the Hellcat's engineering advantages. U.S. carrier strike groups could operate with significantly reduced risk, aware that enemy fighters would either be scarce or ineffective. The shift in aerial dynamics from the early to late war years was striking. In 1942, American pilots frequently retreated from encounters with Zeros, but by 1945 the roles had reversed. It was the Japanese pilots who often withdrew at the first sign of Hellcats. This reversal was not accidental, and a key factor in the transformation was the acquisition of the Akutan Zero. Though difficult to quantify precisely, the intelligence gathered from the captured aircraft had an undeniable impact. The test flights conducted by Lieutenant Commander Sanders revealed exploitable weaknesses in the Zero's performance, enabling American tacticians to adapt both fighter design and operational strategies. The F6F Hellcat itself was not conceived solely because of the Akutan Zero, yet insights from the captured plane influenced its development at a critical stage, allowing modifications to be incorporated before mass production. The data also validated and formalized combat tactics. Strategies that pilots had begun to develop through trial and error were now systematically confirmed and codified through Sanders' experiments. The resulting system, combining the F6F's superior design, empirically grounded tactics, rigorous pilot training, and the United States' prodigious production capacity, created an integrated force that decisively overmatched Japanese aviation. Production statistics underscore the contrast. By the end of the conflict, Japan had manufactured roughly 10,500 Zero fighters, which remained their principal naval aircraft. The United States, in just over 3 years, produced 12,275 F6 alongside thousands of 4U Corsairs and other fighter models. While sheer industrial output ensured numerical advantage, The disparity in combat effectiveness reflected the F6F's superior engineering and the tactical framework that leveraged it. The A6M Zero itself met an ironic end. In February 1945, while preparing for a routine training flight at Naval Air Station North Island, it was struck by an out-of-control SB-2C Helldiver, which shattered the aircraft. Despite the loss of the physical plane, components such as gauges were salvaged by William Leonard and distributed to institutions including the National Museum of the United States Navy, the Alaska Heritage Museum, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Its legacy, however, persisted in the operational success of Hellcat squadrons, in the tactical manuals enriched by Sanders' findings, and in the first-hand knowledge that pilots carried into combat. The story of Lieutenant Koga, the young pilot whose Zero had been recovered, adds a poignant dimension. Initially interred on A6M Island, his remains were exhumed in 1947 and reburied on Adak Island in the Aleutian Chain. Later, in 1953, Japanese authorities repatriated 236 bodies, likely including Koga's, for burial in Japan. Koga, who perished at the age of 19, inadvertently contributed to his nation's defeat, his aircraft providing critical intelligence that would ultimately jeopardize thousands of Japanese lives. Historians continue to debate the A6M Zero's significance. Some view it as the single most pivotal intelligence acquisition in the Pacific theater, surpassing even code-breaking in value. Others argue that American victory was already assured by broader factors, with the capture merely expediting the outcome. Japanese historian and former staff officer Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya assessed the capture's consequences as comparable to Japan's Midway defeat, citing the catastrophic impact of revealing the Zero's limitations to American engineers and pilots. Fighter ace William Leonard regarded it as a treasure unlocking vital secrets during a critical phase of the war, while Marine ace Kenneth Walsh credited tactical insights from the Zero with repeatedly preserving his life in early engagements. The truth likely lies between these perspectives. While the A6M Zero was not solely responsible for the Allied triumph, it was a critical component that intersected with industrial capacity, code-breaking, submarine warfare, and other decisive factors. Without the intelligence it provided, the F6F would still have been a formidable fighter, and American forces would likely have prevailed. However, operations would have been slower, riskier, and more costly in lives, with lingering uncertainty about how to neutralize the Zero's strengths. The resulting 19:1 kill ratio exemplified the convergence of multiple factors. Superior aircraft engineered for both performance and pilot protection, tactically informed doctrine derived from the enemy's weaknesses, rigorous pilot training, and overwhelming industrial production. Together, these elements ensured that by war's end, American naval aviation achieved a level of dominance unmatched in the Pacific theater. Critical intelligence about Japan's main fighter aircraft emerged unexpectedly when a nearly undamaged plane was discovered in the remote Aleutian Islands. This single find provided a wealth of technical insight that would prove decisive in the Pacific theater. Decades after World War II, American pilots who had flown the F6F Hellcat came together at reunions to share their recollections. Many of these gatherings included veterans who had achieved dominance in aerial combat across the Pacific, recounting their experiences and paying tribute to comrades who did not return. A recurring theme in these meetings was the role of the so-called A6M Zero and the vital intelligence it provided. Veterans recalled how understanding the captured Zero's limitations fundamentally changed their approach to air combat. They discussed the techniques pioneered by test pilots, such as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, whose observations revealed that the Zero struggled with high-speed rolls and could stall under negative G-forces. Pilots explained that these insights directly influenced tactics in the air and informed the design improvements of the F6F. Many stressed that, while the Zero initially seemed invincible, its early engagements leaving American pilots awed and fearful, the knowledge gained from the captured aircraft made it a defeatable opponent. They learned that it was lightly built, prone to catching fire when damaged, and far less maneuverable at high speeds than previously assumed. The F6F Hellcat, benefiting from these lessons, became a reliable platform that allowed pilots to exploit the Zero's vulnerabilities. This combination of aircraft design and tactical intelligence contributed significantly to Allied success in the Pacific. The Hellcat remained a frontline fighter throughout the remainder of the war, gradually sharing the stage with the 4U Corsair as the latter overcame its carrier landing challenges. After the conflict, Hellcats were rapidly phased out in favor of jets and newer propeller-driven aircraft. Some served in reserve units into the early 1952s, while others were repurposed as target drones or dismantled. By 1954, only 9 years after the war ended, the last Navy Hellcat had retired. This quick obsolescence reflected the extraordinary pace of aeronautical innovation during and after World War II. What had been cutting edge in 1943 could no longer compete with early jet aircraft capable of twice the speed and triple the climb rate. Despite this, the Hellcat's combat record ensured its legacy endured. Museums across the United States now preserve many F6Fs, some fully restored to flying condition. Airshow audiences continue to marvel at their distinctive silhouettes and roaring engines, evoking an era when U.S. naval aviation achieved air superiority through a combination of engineering skill and tactical ingenuity. Globally, roughly 70 Hellcats survive, with 7 still airworthy in the United States, flown for commemorative events and historical demonstrations. Each flight honors not only the thousands of pilots who flew these aircraft, but also the thousands of enemy planes they destroyed. In contrast, the A6M Zero itself survives only in fragments scattered across museums and in extensive archival records of testing and intelligence analysis at the National Archives. Yet the impact of this single aircraft on the outcome of the Pacific War was immense. Captured almost by accident, examined for only a brief period, and ultimately destroyed, it yielded knowledge that decisively shaped aerial strategy and helped secure Allied victory. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, the test pilot who first evaluated the captured Zero, witnessed the Hellcat's combat effectiveness firsthand. Throughout the war, he continued in various testing and evaluation roles, influencing the development of multiple aircraft types. After retiring from the Navy, Sanders contributed to the post-war aerospace industry, applying his expertise during a period of rapid technological advancement. He passed away in the 1972, having observed the transformation of naval aviation from piston-powered fighters to supersonic jets. Sanders seldom spoke publicly about the A6M Zero, viewing it as one of many assignments in a career dedicated to advancing U.S. naval aviation. Nonetheless, the intelligence derived from that one aircraft, coupled with the Hellcat's engineering, left a lasting mark on military aviation history, an enduring example of how knowledge and innovation together can alter the course of war. Those who worked alongside him understood the significance of his contributions. Through meticulous test flights, careful documentation, and keen analytical observations, he shaped the way American forces understood the enemy and indirectly informed the design choices of the F6F Hellcat. He performed his duties with quiet professionalism at a critical juncture, demonstrating the profound impact that precise, disciplined work can have on wartime outcomes. The case of the A6M Zero and the Hellcat extends lessons far beyond the Second World War. Modern militaries invest enormous resources in intelligence gathering, technical study, and threat evaluation because the A6M Zero illustrated the extraordinary value of detailed knowledge about an adversary. Every captured aircraft, every defector who shares technical insight, and every intelligence tip that exposes vulnerabilities can serve as a strategic key, much like the Zero itself. Awareness of an opponent's strengths and limitations can decisively shape battles, the development of weapon systems, and the formulation of tactical doctrine. The Zero arrived at a moment of maximum potential impact. Eddie Sanders' test flights exposed critical flaws precisely when American pilots were preparing to confront the formidable Japanese fighter. The tactical insights derived from those flights were disseminated just as training programs could incorporate them. Had the Zero been recovered a year earlier or later, the opportunity to leverage its intelligence might have been far less consequential. Timing, in this instance, amplified the value of a single aircraft. In 1942, the Japanese Zero was arguably the finest carrier-based fighter in the world, surpassing nearly all U.S. aircraft in terms of agility and performance. Yet America's capacity to produce vast numbers of F6Fs, train tens of thousands of aviators, and maintain long-term operations across the Pacific created advantages the Zero's technical superiority could not counterbalance. Industrial scale and sustained operational capability, combined with tactical intelligence, proved decisive. The F6F Hellcat and the A6M Zero exemplified two complementary facets of warfare. The Hellcat was the product of American industrial strength, engineering expertise, and the application of tactical insight. The A6M Zero, by contrast, was an unplanned boon, an opportunity that delivered essential intelligence on enemy weaknesses. Together, they formed a synergy that transformed U.S. naval aviation from a vulnerable defensive force in early 1942 to a dominant power in the Pacific by mid-1944. The young Japanese pilot whose aircraft ended up in an Alaskan swamp could not have foreseen the role his plane would play in shaping the outcome of the conflict. His comrades, hoping he survived, could not imagine that their decision not to destroy his plane would indirectly seal the fate of many of their own. The American salvage crews laboring in freezing, marshy conditions had no way of knowing they were retrieving a linchpin for air superiority, and Sanders, taxiing the Zero for its first U.S. flight, could not have fully grasped the scale of the impact his evaluations would have on the development of a fighter capable of changing the war. Yet history is often made at such intersections of luck, preparation, and timely opportunity. The A6M Zero exemplified one such critical moment. Through Sanders' careful analysis, the U.S. identified exploitable weaknesses in what was considered an almost invincible fighter. The Hellcat was then designed to exploit these vulnerabilities ruthlessly, combining raw American industrial capacity with tactical knowledge. By the time U.S. pilots flew the F6F into combat, they carried not just superior machinery but detailed intelligence on their opponent's limitations. Training and doctrine had been updated to reflect these insights, eroding the aura of invincibility surrounding Japanese pilots. The resulting 19-1 kill ratio was no accident. It was the product of intelligence, disciplined preparation, and the effective translation of knowledge into strategy. This episode underscores that victory in warfare depends as much on understanding and adaptation as on courage and firepower. The partnership between the A6M Zero and the F6F Hellcat demonstrates how a single captured aircraft, coupled with skilled analysis, can reshape the course of a conflict. It highlights the interplay of industrial might, engineering proficiency, and the intelligent application of information. What might seem like a minor opportunity, one plane, one test pilot, one moment in time, can alter the trajectory of an entire theater of war. Ultimately, the A6M Zero revealed that even the most celebrated enemy weapons have weaknesses. The F6F Hellcat exploited those flaws systematically, giving U.S. pilots both the tools and the knowledge to dominate the skies. The combination of meticulous analysis, intelligent design, and strategic foresight transformed American naval aviation into a decisive force, demonstrating that true advantage often comes not from brute strength alone, but from the insight to understand and capitalize on the enemy's vulnerabilities.